Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Thomas Fujiwara. I co-direct the Brazil lab at Peers with João Bio, who is in his well-deserved sabbatical this year. Um, so today we have a fantastic team here speaking with you guys. So it's Patrícia, Campos, Mello, and Brian Winter are our main speakers, and Deborah Yasha is our discussant. So let me very briefly introduce them, and without much ado, let them get to the substance here. Patrícia Campos Mello is an editor-at-large at Folha de São Paulo, which is Brazil's leading newspaper. With over 25 years of experience, she has covered international relations, technology, and human rights, reported from more than 50 countries. Patrícia has received numerous accolades, including Columbia University Maria Morris Cabot Award and the Vladimir Herzog Special Award for Democracy and Justice. She is the author of the best-selling book A Máquina do Ódio, which is a fantastic book on social media and politics work in Brazil. That's my own editing of the blurb here, sorry, which explores disinformation campaigns by populist leaders in Brazil, India, and the US. Brian Winter, who's regular speaker here at the Brazil Lab now, is an editor-in-chief at the Americas Quarterly and one of Latin America's most influential political analysts. He has lived in Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and as a correspondent for Reuters before assuming his current role in New York. Brian is also the Vice President for Policy for the American Society and the Council of the Americas. He's author of several books, including The Accidental President of Brazil, and a book aimed for visitors to São Paulo, which has come out, or is it coming out?
It comes out in September.
Yeah, okay, trying to be timely here too. Yeah, all right. And our discussant is, you know her well, it's Deborah Yasha. She's the Donald Stokes Professor of Public and International Affairs and Politics. Sorry. Professor of Politics and Public and International Affairs, and the director of the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies, Peers, the umbrella organization which Brazil Lab is part of. Her scholarship focuses on democracy and authoritarianism, state building and citizenship, social movements, and ethnic and immigration policies. Yeah. So we don't want, I don't know which one is speaking first. So go ahead, Patrícia. We decided that. Thank you.
Hear me now? Okay. It's a huge honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. First time in Princeton. Well, I'm a reporter. So I thought about speaking about the main issues that are affecting the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the US and might affect. And this is based on conversations and stories that I've been doing in the last few months, speaking to government officials in Brazil, government officials, mainly former government officials in the US, businessmen, opposition leaders, etc. And I mean, we just as an introduction, we could say that it's a very particular situation we have now. On the one hand, in Brazil, we have Lula and Lula's administration in a very weakened position. We just saw this first poll showing that his disapproval rating surpassed approval rating for the first time, is the Quest poll. Approval dropped from 52% in December to 47%, while disapproval rose from 47% to 49%. I mean, of course, analysts are all discussing, what is happening, but there's a few things that are coming together, which is food inflation, something that you might recall with Joe Biden here. This has a very acute impact on public opinion. The fact that the executive branch has much less power than it used to because of the amendments. I mean, Congress has so much power over the budget that the whole concept of presidential presidentialism of coalition, which is, something that has been the rule in Brazil for so many years, is now, threatened, this scheme, because the executive has much less power. And also the Lula government, and we were talking about this before, in the previous administrations of Lula, he always had a strong accomplishment for the government, be like Bolsa Família or Mais Médicos. And this time, even for marketing purposes, there's not one government program that has a big recall and it's mobilizing people and public opinion. And then on the other hand, we know what is happening here in the US. There's a huge ideological shift, and this has an impact. I mean, up until a few months ago, we sort of had an alliance between Brazil and the US, which was an alliance to defend democracy. Two countries that had survived coup attempts, presidents who had defeated far-right candidates, and they were cooperating in investigations, in the understanding of the importance of democracy. And then now we have Lula government in the same place, pretty much, even though weakened internally. And now Trump administration, which embraces electoral denialism, free speech in this very particular sense of free speech embraced or hijacked by the far right. And in general, I mean, very aligned with Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, in terms of the conservative cultural values, free speech, and even the unfounded accusations of electoral fraud. So we can say that Lula and Trump are antipodas. How can I say this? Are like opposite poles, sort of, in this sense. There's one thing. The other thing that also Trump is very much aligned with Bolsonaro is also his agenda of deregulation, which is very important. And also, the whole anti-DEI measures that he's been implementing. All that is actually the opposite of what Lula administration is trying to do. We have, and one more thing that is very important in terms of the alliance defending democracy, something that is very interesting that happened in Brazil in 2021 and 2020, is that the US government, mainly the then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, but also the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, they were very clear, very outspoken in terms of telling then President Bolsonaro and the military in Brazil back then that they would not accept if they, said the election was fraudulent, or if they didn't accept the results of an election that was fair. And the fact the U.S. was one of the first countries to recognize the results of the Brazilian presidential elections in 2022. And all that was very important for the stability of the country and us not having a coup d'etat, which is kind of ironic, or you could think that is maybe some sort of atonement because the U.S. supported the military coup in 1964. Whatever the reasons or motivations, there was a strong bond in this, defending democracy alliance, which now is absolutely broken. So this dynamic has changed, and also the whole narrative about the coup attempts here, as you know, Trump pardoned all the attackers of the January 6th, the Capitol invasion, and he used to call them and still calls them hostages. In Brazil, there is a concerted effort to have a bill in Congress to give amnesty to everybody who was involved in the January 8th coup attempt in Brazil as well. And also this whole narrative, it was not a coup attempt, it was just, free speech, was a legitimate protest, blah, blah, blah. So in Brazil, and this is one next chapter that I think is going to be interesting to watch the developments here, is in maybe 1 month or 2 months, we should know if the general prosecutor is going to accept. It's a very complex, maybe Minister Barroso, of course, would be much better than I am to explain. But basically, there's an investigation of Bolsonaro's involvement in the coup attempt, in inciting the coup attempt. And this year, we should have a trial. The Supreme Court has to accept the denuncia of the prosecutors in order to have a trial of the president. This is very likely to happen. And one of the first tests of the bilateral relationship that I think we're going to see is if Bolsonaro is found guilty of inciting a coup d'etat, what is going to be the reaction of the Trump administration? What if Bolsonaro is arrested because of that? What is going to be the reaction of the Trump administration? And for domestic politics, what is going to be the impact of having Bolsonaro found guilty or even arrested? What's the impact in terms of the opposition? Is that going to be a rallying cry for the opposition? Is that going to empower or mobilize the Bolsonaro supporters? I mean, what are the effects? This is one of the things that I think it's going to be very interesting to follow. The other thing is free speech. Free speech is such an interesting thing. I mean, the way that the meaning of free speech evolved and the way that it has different meanings according to different people. The fact that in Brazil's opposition and with the Trump administration, there's a similar view that basically social media and in general, there was a concerted effort to censor conservative voices and opinions, including in social media. We had in 2021 two bills, one in Texas and one in Florida. The one in Florida basically would fine social media platforms that banned or moderated content of people running for office or holding office. And the one in Texas would also prevent social media companies from moderating because of different opinions or point of views, right? I mentioned this because it's interesting. In Brazil, a few months after that, Bolsonaro, then the president, he had medida provisória, which is like a provisional order, saying almost the same thing. Because it's the same view, you know, that there is like an organized effort to censor conservative voices. And one of the biggest, let's say, expressions of this that is happening is this open war between Elon Musk and Alexandre de Moraes, the now famous Supreme Court justice in Brazil, who suspended X in Brazil, the whole platform, last year. This happened after X first, they closed the local office, and there's legislation stating that you need to have a local office in Brazil to act as a social media company. And second, he did not comply with orders to remove content, several orders to remove content. So then this led to Alexandre de Moraes banning or blocking X for a few months in Brazil. And after that, X finally complied with orders, and it's back, it's back on. But this became a very sensitive topic. We had a hearing in U.S. Congress beginning of last year with Republican lawmakers, specifically about censorship in Brazil and moderation of content in Brazil. And now in September, there was a letter by 4 Republican congressmen and 1 Republican senator, to the State Secretary, Antony Blinken, requesting that Alexandre de Moraes' visa be revoked because, he was leading a persecution of conservative voices and censorship in Brazil. Of course, that did not go ahead. It went nowhere. But we don't know what are going to be the next chapters of this story under Trump government. Because as we know, and I'm not sure if you guys saw this video that Elon Musk posted a few days after President Trump was elected about the industrial censorship complex. It's basically Trump saying, what we have is progressive politicians, progressive people using the fight against disinformation as a tool for censorship. We have a gigantic censorship complex, and this has to stop, and because we need free speech. And there's been a lot of talk about some sort of sanctions against countries or people that they see as violating First Amendment, violating the right to free speech. So this is something also that I think it's going to develop, because now we have two separate blocks. We have, on the one hand, the US against any kind of regulation on big tech, and in this defense of free speech, in the sense of free speech for Trump supporters, against the European Union, which has already implemented two big pieces of legislation, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, and Brazil, which has been trying to approve legislation to regulate social media since 2020. It has not succeeded yet. It has been facing the strong opposition, the big tech lobby and the Bolsonarista legislators, but the government has not given up on that. They are about to introduce a bill that actually targets antitrust. It's an antitrust bill specific for big tech. And in a few months, 3 months, the Supreme Court in Brazil is going to rule, is going to have a decision about this investigation on our version of Section 230, Marco Civil da Internet, which is basically about the liability regime of platforms. And it might change the whole game and make American companies, mainly American companies, tech companies, much more likely to be fined and to be held responsible for online violations. So President Trump has already said that he's going to retaliate against taxation, specifically on tech companies, which is something that Canada and France and some other countries are doing already. So what if Brazil finally manages to implement a tax on tech companies, which is the other effort, or gets this bill, this antitrust bill approved? Is Trump going to honor his alliance with the big tech bosses that we saw the best image in his inauguration, during his inauguration? Is he going to embrace, I think even Zuckerberg said, it's American he said on Joe Rogan, the podcast, it's American companies, government has to defend American companies. How is this going to develop? Are we going to see some shocks between Brazilian government and Trump administration because of big tech, because of new legislation in Brazil, or because of taxation in Brazil? So this is the second thing. The other thing, and also here, which is interesting, like one of the things that the big tech companies here expect is that all the antitrust investigations, there's several investigations by the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission here for anti-competitive practices like self-preferencing, some others from Amazon, Apple, and the expectation, maybe in exchange for big tech full-throated support to Trump, is that all these investigations are not going to get anywhere. So his attention and their attention is going to be elsewhere in other countries where other governments are trying to hold big tech responsible. How is that going to develop? Is Trump going to retaliate somehow? So this is the other thing. Sorry. So the other point, there's positive things, I swear. At some point, but not in internet regulation. But not yet positive things. Tariffs. Tariffs, we in Brazil and the government, everybody's like, okay, so as of now, there are no tariffs for us. It's only China, not only, Canada and Mexico, and they suspended Canada and Mexico. But of course, there's no reason to think that Brazil would be spared. In President Trump's first administration, Brazil was targeted with tariffs on aluminum and steel. They were later converted into quotas. but there's no reason to think we're going to be spared. The other thing that is also President Trump himself, he mentioned, I think by now twice, that Brazil is one of the countries that treats unfairly American companies, and he criticized also the way that make American companies pay too much. So this is something that is going to happen. And then we have two things. How is Brazil going to react? It's reasonable to think President Lula has already said that he's going to retaliate, right? As Canada and China and all the other countries did. And it's also a way of getting a nationalist approach in Brazil might be a way of galvanizing support for President Lula. We cannot forget that he's in a very weakened position politically now. And being, I'm defending the Brazilian domestic industry, it's always, for the public opinion, but sometimes a winning proposition. So how is that going to develop? And that's not even mentioning the BRICS country, because that's the other point that President Trump has also threatened to impose 100% tariffs on products from BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now it's expanded. If BRICS continues its discussion, because it's still a discussion, there's nothing happening about moving away from the dollar, having more trade in the country's currencies. So that might be another point of friction. So this is another point. Migration. No, there's two positive. Sorry. Migration. We saw last week this plane that arrived in Brazil with 80 deportees, and they claimed that they were mistreated. They were, they were all wearing handcuffs, which it happened before like this, but on top of that, they say that they were beaten up, blah, blah, blah. Right after that, we saw what happened with President Gustavo Petro from Colombia, because he said, it's not acceptable that people are being treated in this undignified way, so I'm not letting these planes land with the Colombian deportees. And Trump reacted saying, okay, so you're not accepting the planes, I'm going to impose tariffs on you, and you won't have visas, blah, blah. And he backed down. So Lula, as of now, he toned down his rhetoric after this plane incident happened. Of course, the ministry, Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, they got the chargé d'affaires, for talking about the issue, and Itamaraty issued a statement against this, and Lula also said, but it's like they're keeping under control. But what if with this mass deportation program, if it goes ahead, we have around 2 million Brazilians living in the US. Itamaraty doesn't say how many of those are here undocumented. And we know that 38,000 have already been, according to ICE, they have already final deportation orders now, Brazilians. So at least 38,000 Brazilians would be deported. What are the odds that you're going to have mistreatment in one of those flights? And what are the odds that next time the diplomatic way is not going to solve the problem, or it's going to escalate somehow? So this is another source. And finally, climate change. Brazil was very much expecting a huge political and financial support from the US for the COP30 in Belém in November. Brazil has this ambition, the Brazilian officials, of launching a new climate mitigation financing facility during the COP30. This is the grand ambition. We already saw how the US leaving the Paris climate agreement is impacting. This is not going to take effect until next year, but still, it's already having an effect. We saw this in the COP29 in Baku and also at the G20 in Rio, because the Europeans are much less willing to commit to giving resources. They want developing countries now to have mandatory financial contributions for mitigation. And this is, a non-starter for a lot of the countries, including Brazil. So it's already complicating the negotiations, which were already very complicated. And now it sort of spoils all this plan of the Brazilian government of launching this financing facility. So we must see how this is going to develop. This is a second thing. No, I'm not even getting into the fact that USAID had 72 million in grants for Brazil in 2023. This is the latest data before they took the website down. And most of it was for, forest management, Amazon. This is all gone now. It's not, you're going to say, well, it's not a lot of money. No, compared to Ukraine or compared even to Colombia. But for Brazilian organizations, it's a huge deal. It's having a huge impact. So climate change is also a big issue. Now, issues that might be positive. China. Of course, the growing influence of China in Latin America is a huge source of concern also for the Trump administration. So we saw, you recently saw Secretary Marco Rubio's visit to Panama and how outspoken he was in saying, you have to reduce the influence of China, otherwise you're going to take back the channel, the Panama Channel. And Panama announced that it would not extend its membership to the Belt and Road Initiative. Brazil is in the middle of the negotiations. Xi Jinping expected Brazil to join the Belt and Road Initiative during the G20, and the Brazilian government, doesn't see much in it for Brazilian government because, it already gets investment. So Brazil was trying to get something in exchange for that, some more concrete promises or investment announcements. It didn't happen. But still, there's this, it's a bargaining chip. Brazil, getting even closer to China, Belt and Road. This might be something useful to work with President Trump, who's basically transactional. So there could be something in it. Because as we remember, it was under the Trump administration in 2019, I think, that there was a huge pressure on Brazil and several other countries to block Huawei equipment from the 5G infrastructure. And in Brazil, even though the president was Jair Bolsonaro, pretty much aligned with Trump, it did not block Huawei because all the telecommunications companies, they need Huawei cheap equipment. And the US did not get there with some like China does with the China Development Bank loans. They did not get there with the, what's that called, the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, like loans. Now you can block Huawei and install Siemens or whatever you want to. No, it was just the stick, no carrots, and it did not work. How is the Trump administration going to work regarding this? Regarding, in preserving Brazil from China's influence or China growing presence in the telecommunications sector and infrastructure. So this is another thing that I think in the end might be positive for both countries to get closer. I'm not getting into, we have foreign direct investment. That's not going to change. Companies have interest. Of course, thank God this is going to, all continue to work. But I'm thinking, tension, issues that might cause tensions. And finally, critical minerals. 1 second. Sorry. This is something that every single person I speak to talks about, the need, and there's been several reports, and the current administration in the U.S. is also pretty much concerned in reducing how much the U.S. depends on China for the supply of critical minerals. As you know, that they are used in a whole lot of high technology products and energy products. Brazil, for instance, produces 90% of the world's niobium and has 94% of the world's reserves, 22.5% of graphite reserves, 16% of rare earths, third largest in the world, and 16% of nickel. And they just discovered important lithium reserves in Minas Gerais. Remember last time I spoke to then Ambassador Elizabeth Bagley? She specifically said, we really want to have an agreement with Brazil for preferential access to this critical mineral supply. So they even tried, and there was, under the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a provision that gave tax benefits to some countries, but only the ones that had free trade agreements, so except for Japan. So they were trying to figure out something. It did not work and ended up not having an agreement. But I am sure this is a path that the Trump administration is still going to follow, and it might make it less, I mean, who are we to predict anything? But I was saying maybe more willing to negotiate, taking into account that Brazil might be an important supplier of critical minerals. And we saw, for instance, I think yesterday, President Trump mentioned Ukraine and rare earths in Ukraine, and that maybe they should, supply rare earths in exchange for the military aid that the U.S. is giving Ukraine. So maybe there's some way of negotiation or tension alleviation through this business interests, which we know are pretty much, up in front for President Trump. And last, I think one of the biggest fears that we have is that nationalism could be very appealing and a quick way to improve approval ratings in any countries, as we know, and in Brazil as well. So President Lula could very well use some of the actions of President Trump, be it, deportees or tariffs, and go overboard, in trying to say, I'm defending my country, which other countries are doing, but that might escalate and get out of control in the, trade, be it the trade war or. So I think this is something that not only in Brazil, but particularly in Brazil, where Lula is facing not like some political instability, it is a concern. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I spoke too much. Sorry.
Boa tarde, good afternoon. Thank you, Micaeus, and everybody here for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share a stage with my friend Patrícia Campos Mello, who is one of the best connected and most brave journalists in Brazil. And
You're the most generous. I'm not.
I always say when I'm here, I can't believe the quality of people that you guys are able to bring. I hope that everybody here appreciates. It's not common to have somebody come all the way up from Brazil and be able to speak to you and have a conversation about these things. So it's very humbling for me to be here. Of course, I'm not Brazilian, but I've been doing my best for 20 years to try to understand Brazil and specifically the relationship with the United States. So I have two main ideas I want to focus on today. And I'm going to try to do so without repeating too much what Patrícia said, because that was a very comprehensive presentation. The first idea is that I think a clash between Trump and Lula is inevitable. I think any day now we're going to see a tweet that has Lula's name in it and probably a bunch of all caps and some specific threats about, sanctions or tariffs or something like that. And, there are some structural reasons for that, which Patrícia alluded to. The fact that Lula is on the left and therefore not aligned with kind of the worldview, the fact that the Trump family is very close to the Bolsonaro family, the fact that they believe that Lula supports Cuba and Venezuela, which used to be more true than it is now. Actually, Brazil has a somewhat nuanced position on Venezuela after the elections that took place in July. It's clear for reasons that I don't totally understand that President Trump is very focused on this idea of a BRICS currency and de-dollarization more broadly. I'm not an economist, but my understanding is that the idea of, it's almost impossible to conceive of an actual BRICS currency. But it's something that the president's very worried about. And so as a result, Brazil is on his radar screen in part because of that. It's worth pointing out that in a stroke of fate, Brazil actually has the presidency of BRICS this year and will host the summit. So that could increase kind of the scrutiny there. China, which Patrícia already mentioned at large, Brazil not only has China as its number one trading partner, but there's a key Chinese presence in what Washington sees as strategic assets as well. The kind of line that you hear from people in actually both the Republican and the Democratic Party now is they say, well, we can't ask Brazil or any other country not to trade with China because we trade with China. But what the sort of line for us is presence in 5G, in ports, in electrical generation, and other, quote unquote, strategic assets. Here again, Brazil has a unique, or at least somewhat nuanced position because it has good relationship with Beijing, but did not join BRI. And they even carved out an exception for government phones with the Huawei deal, which gets into sort of technical things. But the domestic conditions that you mentioned, I think, are really important too, because if we've seen anything, if we've been reminded of things in these 15 days, can you believe it's only been 15 days? Yeah, it's like 15 months. But we've been reminded in these 15 days that Donald Trump does not see the world in terms of allies. He sees it in terms of strength and weakness and in terms of what he perceives as the U.S. national interest. And so, Lula, his approval rating's down a little bit. 47% is still not that bad. I feel like in today's polarized world, 47 is like 57 or even 67 used to be. But trends are sort of heading in the wrong direction after 3 years where the Brazilian economy consistently outperformed the market's expectations, where we saw GDP growth above 3% a year every year. We can talk later if you want about kind of why that's happening, but it has helped, I think, Lula sustain some popularity. But there was, I think, a turning point in this administration in November when they announced a long-awaited fiscal package that really disappointed the market. And as a result, you've seen confidence really crater, and the real was the worst performing currency of 2024, lost 30% of its value, in part because of this. And so I guess the point for this discussion is Trump could well look at Lula and at Brazil under those circumstances and sense that weakness that is like catnip for him sometimes. There's also more personal reasons. Trump seems to really like having franchises almost around the world. And one of the franchises that he likes the most, that his team has the most connectivity with, is the Brazilian franchise, the Bolsonaro family. There are parallels that, in fact, are actually quite different, between the U.S. story and the Brazil story, between the criminal case against Jair Bolsonaro and the criminal cases against Donald Trump and January 6th and January 8th and what happened here and what happened there. But, I would say that even in the best of times, ignorance of Brazil and the United States is extensive. And I think that the parallels are too tempting. Even with the date, the fact that it was January 8th, even there was not a lot of originality. And it's also true that there's a lot of people in South Florida, Brazilians in South Florida, who have considerable influence in the Trump space. And they've spent the last 2 years, 2 years, I guess, peddling this idea that Brazil has become another Venezuela. And somebody who cares a lot about Venezuela and Venezuelan democracy, I find the comparison offensive, frankly, because I think it banalizes what's happening in Venezuela, which is terrible. But they've been peddling that narrative, and they've had some success, and they've had success with very specific people, including Elon Musk, who had this big fight with Brazilian authorities and specifically the Supreme Court, and specifically one Supreme Court Justice, Alexandre de Moraes, last year. And Elon Musk lost, and he doesn't lose very often. I'm sure that left a bad taste in his mouth, and I have no doubt that Brazil remains on his radar in part for that reason. But it's not just Elon Musk. Steve Bannon also knows Brazil very well, has deep contacts with the Bolsonaro family, specifically Eduardo Bolsonaro, the president's sort of most internationally oriented son. But even Jason Miller, you guys know who he is, but he integral part of the Trump campaign, who during the, what are we calling it? Like the interregnum between the two Trump terms, was founded a social network that had a big presence in Brazil, made a trip to Brazil, and was briefly detained on the runway in Brasilia by, guess who? Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. And so you have like, these are all, I mean, I've named 3 very powerful people, very influential people in this administration who all have Trump's ear for different reasons. And, you know, look, I would say I don't want to be overly dismissive of the core concerns. Like, there is actually a real debate over like political speech in Brazil and what's allowed and what's not, and whether this justice has gone too far. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit too, if people like. Well, it's a really difficult subject. But for all these reasons, I think that Trump is, again, it's just, you can set your watch. It's a matter of time until he's going to turn his attention and try to take on Brazil, because among other reasons, in some ways, Brazil is a perfect low-cost target. It's a big country. It's an important country. It's one that people know. It's been in the news. But for him to announce tariffs or sanctions it's not risky to the U.S. and the U.S. economy in the same way that it has been with Mexico. You know, 25% tariffs on Mexico implies a severe cost for the U.S. economy. And that's part of the reason why it appears to be one of the reasons why President Trump backed off of that before they actually went into practice 48 hours ago. It seems like it was like 2 weeks ago, but it was literally the day before yesterday. With Brazil, it's not that difficult. Brazil is actually, in terms of trade over GDP, it's one of the world's most closed economies. And there's not that much trade between Brazil and the United States. Like in volume, it's a lot, but it's not. Anyway, point is, Trump won't be disincentivized in the same way that he would be with some other countries. So what does it mean in practice? Like, what would the confrontation look like? You know, I think starting with some kind of sanctions or maybe visa withdrawals for people on the Brazilian Supreme Court, specifically Alexandre de Moraes. It could escalate. It could even be, it could be tariffs. I mean, it could be like a 10% or a 25% tariff against Brazil, unless you allow President Bolsonaro to recover his political rights and stop persecuting him like you persecuted me. Not at all hard to imagine that. It could even, he showed us, President Trump kind of showed us his arsenal with these threats that he made against the Colombian government on Sunday, 10 days ago, which also included things like Treasury Department sanctions and things that would have really ground business there to a halt. So he has this, especially when it's asymmetrical, which frankly it almost always is. The United States is big. And when he senses weakness and a fight that he's going to win, he has shown that he will literally put the entire arsenal on the table in an effort to win and win big, and maybe even encouraged on that front by the outcome of his confrontation with President Petro in Colombia. So I said I had 2 points. One of them was that I think a confrontation is coming. And the second point is, I'm not sure how much it matters. basically because you can't fight with everybody. And, I was bizarrely in Panama the day after he made the threat, when he explicitly said, this was 2 weeks ago, when he explicitly said that he wanted the canal back in his inaugural speech, less than 24 hours. I was on the ground in Panama as part of a trip that I'd planned several weeks before. Nobody believed me. And, the way that country was just thrown into panic, understanding how severe the consequences could be, was something to watch. And I think that confrontation was all about China and was an attempt, at least at some level, to show that the United States is trying to not only enforce but move the line of what Washington considers acceptable in terms of Chinese presence in some of these strategic assets. And I use that phrasing knowing that talking about what's acceptable and what's not sounds very anachronistic in some ways. These are sovereign countries. These are sovereign countries, full stop. But each country has to then make its sovereign decision about how they're going to deal with these threats. And I would say that in the case of Panama, and here, I know this isn't a Panama event, but you can actually make the case, and I had a fascinating trip, and you can make the case that Panama and the canal specifically is something of an exception. It is in a class of its own when it comes to strategically important to the United States, like geography in Latin America. It takes 40% of U.S. maritime container trade and 5% of global trade overall. When Trump said that China controls the canal and that Chinese troops are in the canal, categorically false. But the presence of the Chinese via the Hong Kong-based company that controls the ports at both ends, could those actually be used to sabotage or slow down or otherwise damage shipping in the event of a conflict in a way that would severely damage the U.S. economy and also damage the U.S. Navy's ability to get assets from the Atlantic over to the Pacific and vice versa? Actually, I came away from this trip convinced to listen to people that the answer to that is yes. And so, maybe the fact that they chose this as a battle this early on, maybe there's some sense or some strategically sound thinking behind that. But, then Marco Rubio came and it kind of passed. And I traveled from Panama then to Colombia. I arrived on the Saturday, and then on Sunday morning at 4 a.m., President Petro sends his tweet where he refuses the deportation flight mid-flight, and this triggers the huge confrontation with President Trump that day. I'm not an egocentric person, but I did start wondering if I was the problem somehow. That came and went. And that was sort of worth analyzing on its own. All I'll say about it is I believe that President Petro, the underlying grievance, certainly legitimate. The conditions and he was reacting, as you said, he was actually reacting not to the conditions on that flight that was coming to his own country. He was reacting to what had been in the Brazilian press and on social media about this flight that landed in Manaus, where the reports were, yes, handcuffs, that was common, but that there was no air conditioning, that the plane broke down multiple times, that they were not allowed to use the restroom. And as a result, the passengers, and this is clear, the passengers, after the plane landed unexpectedly in Manaus, they went out on the wing and started screaming for the federal police to come. So point is, there was legitimate grievance to what President Petro was worried about. I think it's going to continue to be an issue, not just for Brazil, but across Latin America and countries all over the world. However, a tweet at 4 in the morning, bypassing any institutional challenges. He didn't talk to his ambassador. He didn't go through his foreign ministry. It was tactically, put it this way, a decision that the rest of the Colombian government instantly worked to backpedal on. And they spent all day Sunday, his foreign minister, the the business community, representatives from all parties, including former President Uribe, who is as opposed to Petro as it gets, but he participated in some of these discussions in order to diffuse this thing and stop this bomb from exploding, a financial bomb from exploding before markets opened on Monday. Then it was Mexico and Canada. And that was another crisis that was kind of averted at the last minute. And now we've had Gaza. And now I see, like, as we walk in, I don't know about you, but like my heart leaps every time I get a notification on this thing now. It's like, what fresh hell awaits us now? I see that he's got officials off the record, I think, trying to walk back what he was saying about Gaza yesterday. And the bottom line is, I'm starting to wonder how effective this government's going to be. And if he does, or not if he does, when he does take aim inevitably at Brazil, will his government have the power, the focus, and the organizational capacity to follow through on all of these threats? And they might. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, the U.S. government's a very powerful thing, and he has organized people who are part of his government. But what we've seen here in the first 15 days has started, like 5 days ago, I started to basically think that these guys are not as organized as I expected them to be. And that the absence of people like, people from the first term, like James Mattis, the defense secretary, or John Kelly, the chief of staff, or even, people like Mike Pompeo or Rex Tillerson, who helped, according to memoirs that were later written and kind of things that came out in the press at the time, helped keep things moving in a certain direction. I wonder if we're seeing the effects of their absence. I would note, and just in conclusion, I want to hear have more of a conversation, but it's interesting to me. Each of these crises, I think I think it's important to acknowledge that President Trump has gotten what he wants in the short term. In the case of Panama, Panama is moving very quickly to, they've announced an audit of the concession for these two ports at either end of the canal. The expectation in Washington is that the government will find a pretext to take away that concession and give it to a non-Chinese company. Panama has also announced that it will not renew its membership in the Belt and Road project. Some other things Panama is doing. Colombia backed down totally. With Mexico and Canada, I know that they announced some things that they're already doing, and there's some talk that maybe there's some what they call border theater where they put troops, but nothing structural actually changes. But in the case of Mexico, which I know a little bit more about, there is an effort by the new government, the Sheinbaum government, to take security more seriously. They've accepted Remain in Mexico, the program that sends third country residents back to Mexico while they supposedly wait for asylum. And I say supposedly because I just think that door is going to be slammed as shut as Trump can legally manage over the next 4 years. But, in all of these cases, I think it's clear that these countries have moved more rapidly and more thoroughly than they would have in a traditional negotiation. That this maximalist approach that President Trump is using is working. My question is about, like, what is the medium-term cost? What does this do to the perception of not only the perception of the United States, but also the strategic thinking that happens in capitals like Brasilia, where they are absolutely watching all of this, not at the center of the game at the moment, but thinking, how does this affect our relationship with China, our relationship with the European Union, how quickly we try to approve the trade deal with between Mercosur and the EU, for example, how we work with our neighbors, like should we mend fences with Milei and with Argentina because we actually maybe that's a better relationship than us continuing to depend on this person in this government in Washington that, again, does not see the world in terms of allies, but in terms of just interest and strengths and weaknesses. So I think the U.S. relationship with Brazil and with all of Latin America and indeed the world is changing like every day right now. And you may see short-term success, but the medium and longer term is a much bigger question mark. Thank you.
So lucky me, I get to sit between these two brilliant speakers. I want to start off. Can you hear me? No.
No, mine wasn't on. Maybe that's it. No, that's in the on position. Well, here, you can use mine.
All right.
Yeah, let me use mine.
Here.
All right. Only one. Okay. First of all, I just want to thank Patrícia and Brian for really excellent, provocative, depressing set of comments. But I really just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I think we're all in a state of deep uncertainty, really, about where we are. And so that's where I want to make a few comments and maybe some pretend questions that I've snuck in, which is that we are really, truly, truly living in a moment of uncertainty. Time is incredibly compressed. There have been these references that you've both noted of how much has happened, and yet it feels like it was a lifetime has actually gone on. And that sense of uncertainty makes it extremely hard to speak on a panel. And in many ways, what everybody is highlighting is we have a lot of questions. And I really want to thank you both for highlighting what so many of those questions are before us. But we don't know, or at least I don't know really what is coming down the pike, because so much is unclear. And it's so unclear about what the timeline is, what the effects are going to be, how people are going to respond, and the like. So uncertainty and compressed time, that's the first thing I heard across both of the talks. The second that came across both, although I think, Brian, you named it in particular, but it was fully present in Patrícia's opening comments, is that the nature of power politics really seems to have shifted in this current moment. We knew this was coming. It was articulated during the campaigns, particularly in the United States, but the nature of power politics really has shifted. If we wanted to believe that we were still in a moment of liberal diplomacy that was shaping the nature of the world order, for the moment, that is gone. And in fact, there is a celebration of the power politics, of everyone out for themselves, this celebration of how clever people are if they can get more for themselves, even if in the short term it comes at the expense of others. That has really shifted, particularly in these 2 weeks, 15 days that has happened. And so taking stock of what is the age of Trump, I mean, I would say it's beyond Trump, but heightened by Trump, this moment where we're no longer can take we can no longer take for granted what many people would have said was the celebration of democracy. We can no longer take for granted a celebration of liberalism. We can no longer take for granted a moment where at least there's the presentation of coordination and collaboration on existential challenges, whether or not it's climate, whether or not it's about migration, whether or not it's about trade orders and the like. The nature of power politics has really shifted. And I think across the two of you, there are these fundamental questions of really what is driving this. I mean, I'm not an IR scholar, but I just want to pull out what I heard from these talks. One might be that we're really at a moment where it's really about the leaders. Even the title of the panel is In the Age of Trump. So it is Trump who is really driving this forward. Or maybe it's really about nationalism. It's voters who are really concerned about certain nationalist concerns. They're voting in people who are driving this. Or maybe, to come back to both examples, we're in a moment of just where big tech and the power of inequality and billionaires to really play that economic power dynamic is front and center. And so as you were talking, I was like, well, we're not in the moment of the Cold War and we're not in the moment of the post-Cold War. I think one of the big questions is really how is this world order being defined and what is being celebrated and denigrated in terms of that strength weakness that you had actually talked about. I think the other thing to note is that no one is operating independently. There is a power of diffusion that has happened, Trump learning from Trump, but also Trump learning from Orban and others learning from one another. And so again, this is not only Trump, this is the coordination that is happening across many actors going forward. So, in this context, I guess one of the questions I want to throw out, maybe flipping Brian's comment maybe on its head, I don't know, and responding to Patricia's observations as well, which is in those 2 weeks alone, what can we learn from the responses by Mexico and Canada in terms of responses? I think there's a debate. There are dueling narratives about how much power and how much influence Trump had over Mexico and Canada, but it's an important question for us to think about what we can learn. So the nature of power politics has really changed. The third theme I want to pull out is, what can we learn from Brazil? Because it's not only a panel on Brazil, but if we were to think about the Brazil labs, many panels over the past few years, there have been moments where we were like, what's happening in Brazil? And there's the decline of democracy and the threat to democracy in Brazil. And then last year we talked about there was the clawing back of democracy in the context of Brazil. And last week, Barroso was here and he was talking about the power of the courts to be able to defend against threats to democracy. So what can we learn from Brazil? Not just in terms of the response now, but in terms of the previous administration, in terms of the role of courts and the rule of law, in terms of the ability of politicians and parties to respond. And in particular, I want to say the role of the opposition. So what is the role of political parties? What is the role of civil society? What is the role of other forms of opposition? And here I would say, of course, what is in particular the role of the press? I'll come back to that in a moment. What can we learn from Brazil without being too alarmist? Because I think we're at a moment where we're responding to a moment, but I think we have to look at the circumstances under which institutions seem frail and those moments where they can be built up again. And in fact, the last time Brian was here, if I remember correctly, Brian was really struck by the strengthening of Brazilian institutions over this last year. So what can we learn from that? It strikes me that that's something to consider. Another big theme is really about the role of information and media, because no matter what is actually happening, part of the question is what is being portrayed as happening. And obviously this is Patricia's particular superpower here, is to allow us to think through not just how do we report what's going on, but how do you deal in a world where there are literally dueling narratives and different platforms where people are in echo chambers, where we're not actually always engaging in conversation. So I'm really puzzling through this at a moment where there's the concentration of social media, where Musk is a great example of being able to take over Twitter, engage in all kinds of actions that are very reminiscent of what's happening in the United States right now, firing people and the like, and then having a monopoly. It's not really a monopoly in a literal sense, because there are other platforms, but having a disproportionate power to define the media. So how do we respond to that? And finally, I'll pick up a question that Brian raised for us, which is, what is success? And I have to say, given the critical word that's being used in the last 2 weeks, and what is effectiveness and efficiency as we think about these cases. And I think that's going to be both a question for the United States. What would be considered success and effectiveness and efficiency for Trump? I think that remains to be seen. There's a chess game going on here. So flooding the zone, even if only a few things get through, those things could be critical. And even if a few things get denied, if they come up to the courts and the Supreme Court does engage in a set of rulings that concentrate power, that then lays the groundwork for future action. So what is success? I don't know, but I think that's critical. And since this is a panel on Brazil, I guess I'm really wondering what is success for the Lula administration at a moment, as Patricia said, where the platform, the programmatic platform of this administration is not entirely clear. the Workers' Party is extremely weak. So what would be a sign of success, not just for Lula, but as a sign of success for democracy for the next election? And those are a few of the many, many, many questions that both of you raised for us. I really want to thank them again. I'm now going to retreat and sit over there because your questions are for them, but let's just give them another round of applause before the Q&A comes.
You tell me. Are we supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very brief because I like this question of what can we learn from Brazil, and there's a little bit of a sequel there to maybe last time I was here. You know, I go back and forth on this and my interpretation of what happened in 2022, because I think there are two narratives, maybe more, but two occur to me. One is that this was a wonderful tale of institutional strength and in some cases personal courage in a country that had the experience within recent memory of losing its democracy and getting it back. And, you know, it's very clear to me that there's some truth to this. And I don't know how many of you have seen the wonderful Brazilian film that's out, that's nominated for the Oscar, Ainda Estou Aqui, I'm Still Here, which you know talks about that era and is part of a genre of films that are always revisiting the lessons from that era. It's a wonderful movie. It's just out. Yeah, I actually just managed to see it. Again, I've lost track of time, but like a couple of days ago, I think it was last Friday. And that reflects a country where these stories are still being told and have been told over the last 40 years. And while it's true that there was never the reckoning with, you know, that the military never faced justice in Brazil the same way that they did in Argentina or Chile, still you have a, you know, particularly in the kind of the more educated parts of society, there's a dialogue still and just a very strong memory of those years. And, you know, you also have individuals who acted courageously during that time. And I cite one example. You had within an hour of the voting results being made public on Election Day in 2022, the Brazilian Speaker of the House, Arthur Lira, who had he had campaigned with Bolsonaro. He had worn the Brazilian soccer jersey and the colors of the flag that were a symbol of Bolsonarismo. And yet, within an hour of the result being made public by Brazil's wonderful electronic voting system, he said, the people have spoken, these are the results, and they need to be respected. You know, something that Mitch McConnell never had the courage to do in this country, for example, how different history might have been. So I said that that's one possible narrative. The other narrative is that maybe Jair Bolsonaro just wasn't effective enough when he was in power. And I don't mean effective enough necessarily at overturning the election, which he, by many accounts, including from his former military aide and others, we now know that he was, at the very least, tempted to do, and according to some testimony, actually, gave orders in that direction. But no, when I say that he wasn't very effective, it was that in his administration of the economy, in his administration of the pandemic, that's why Bolsonaro lost. And more to the point, for this discussion, that's why Bolsonaro did not have the support of the Brazilian establishment, the business community, Congress, and the Supreme Court, that he would have needed to overturn the election. I wonder if, and it's very counterfactual, right? But if he had been a more organized, more evidence-based, more focused on the economy in particular, if he had followed some of the things that his finance minister was encouraging him to do, he might have had that power. And this story that I just told, which I believe in, about the strength of Brazilian institutions, it might have been a different story. Who resists an effective authoritarian? I think of Nayib Bukele. And, if Bukele had been president of Brazil and had taken office in 2018, with the total disgrace of the Brazilian political class and the country still stuck in recession and everything else, I think he would have been able to do the same things in Brazil and maybe, in the United States. Who, among us, who resists the strong leader who delivers results on the economy and security? And so I think you talk about what constitutes success. This is why it's a delicate moment for Lula, is because if the wheels start to come off the economy, the popular demand for a return of Bolsonaro is going to get strong. I have to say, nobody at this stage that I know expects anything like the crash that we saw in Brazil in 2014, 2015. People are saying, well, maybe the economy will grow, 1.5% instead of 3%. Would that be enough to pull people back into the streets and really cause this groundswell of support for Bolsonaro? I'm not sure. But Lula's own story also shows that you should never count anybody out in Brazilian politics. So, anything to add?
I'm just going to be quick too. And just remember that some opposition legislators were wearing hats written affordable food again in 2026, Bolsonaro in 2026. So,
sorry to interrupt, but you said during your, I meant to come back to this. You said during your comments that Lula might be tempted to kind of try to rally around the flag and pursue a nationalist approach. I just wanted to point out, in the last 5 days, we've seen the emergence of these hats, these blue hats that are explicitly meant as a kind of a response to the MAGA hats. And they say, what, Brazil para os brasileiros.
Yes.
Is that right?
That was from the communications team came up with this. Yeah, the government communication team.
That's an interesting sign. As preparing for battle.
Brasil para os brasileiros.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt.
No. Thank you for all your comments, Deborah. And one of the things I think it's interesting to mention is comparing what happened in Brazil in 2022 in terms of the two narratives, right? Were there heroes, or were it not for the COVID and the way Bolsonaro dealt with COVID, would we have Lula president? I think that's a fair question, and maybe not. And the other thing I think is checks and balances really worked, in the sense that Bolsonaro had managed to neutralize Congress with distribution of budget amendments, right? So that part of checks and balances was under control. Then the general prosecutor was also following his lead, Aras. So his role was to investigate and make denúncias. How do you say that? Criminal complaints about everything that Bolsonaro was doing to win the election, as in, changing the constitution to be able to have new social programs 3 months before the elections and all those things. But he was not doing anything. And in terms of the way they were trying to manipulate public opinion using this information, so General Prosecutor was not doing anything. So then we have the figure of Justice Alexandre de Moraes into this vacuum, and he was basically the check and balance, together with the Supreme Court, on the one hand, legislating about electoral disinformation, legislating about the attempt of voter suppression in the day of elections, which was blatant. And then you have this discussion, did they overstep their mandate? Maybe that's something that is being discussed, right? I mean, they were doing things that were not that they were not supposed to. I mean, there's several interpretations. The thing is that he continued to do this up until today, which is an issue. But had he not done what he did, maybe Bolsonaro would have won. That's something. So here, if you have, the opposition, democratic opposition, what's the word I'm looking for? Resignados. Resign, like despondent, like they're not, Then you have, he controls not a large margin, but he does control Senate and House. And he controls, well, he has a very, let's see, sympathetic Supreme Court because of his 3 nominees. And he does not have the somewhat independent Mike Pompeo, John Kelly, all those, they don't. He only has people who are pretty much saying yes to everything he says. And you're going to have this purges in the public sector of, people they're not considered loyal. Where's the checks and balances?
Just 30 seconds on that. I mean, we have seen some checks and balances so far in these,
judicial, like some judges ruling against
the judges. Also, the fact that Trump did not get the attorney general he wanted, that was rejected by Republicans in the Senate. He did not get the leader that he wanted in the Senate. He wanted Rick Scott, the Florida senator, instead John Thune, a pretty independent-minded. So it's not, he doesn't have absolute power.
Right, but in the universe of the things he's trying to do.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we'll see.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe the opposition gets, empowered by everything he's doing. That's something too, right? I mean, it's been so radical and so fast that maybe it empowers, I don't know.
So yeah, we have 10 minutes for questions. So I ask you to be short, so our speakers have time to respond. Carolina?
Thank you, Mika. It's wonderful to have you here. Welcome, Patrícia, and welcome again, Brian. I wanted to pick both of your brains if you have time, but Patrícia wrote a book on called the Hate Machine, right? On you mentioned it en passant in your speech when you kickstarted, but it's been 5 years, and so I wanted to pick your brain. What's going on here right now, and how do you deal with it, especially with the new rules that Zuckerberg mentioned, like a turning point. He mentioned as if it were a cultural turning point. There was little already to regulate, right? And we asked the same question also to Barroso, to Supreme Court Justice Barroso, and so he had his view. I want to pick your brains on this view, also as journalists. There's a Princeton professor here called Nolan McCarthy. He has a book called What is Populism? And he actually, he doesn't say the cause of populism is fake news, but he really says that it amplifies the problem, but the dead zones of journalism, especially in the US and in Brazil, there's such high concentration of newspapers. And that definitely, that dead zone, that cemetery of legit news, that definitely contributes. And as we know, the consumption of news now comes more from social media than from newspaper subscriptions per se. Thank you.
Okay. One or two more questions before one. Okay, we have one here.
Thank you both. This is great. I mean, we are all depressed, but it's great. So about the 2 questions about the effectiveness or efficiency, I agree with Deborah. There is something that we are missing here. I mean, we probably miss the tools to understand, the metrics to understand what is efficiency, what is efficient, what is effective, because in the end, chaos, I mean, we've learned that chaos is a method in this case. I mean, it's basically no goal, no end, and whatever you gain on the way, I mean, after you have created this chaos is your gain. But the method is chaos. And I think this is connected to the celebration of force as a drive, according, again, second what Deborah said. So I would love to hear you both about this effectiveness. I mean, until which point can we imagine that they can be in power, even though they are not? I mean the authoritarian leaders. They are not delivering what we used to consider should be delivered in terms of policies and etc. In other words, I mean, Bolsonaro also almost won, even though, I mean, according to our traditional metrics, he was a terrible governor. And the second question is just about the big picture. I mean, the dark times that we seem, I mean, apparently we have ahead of us, and who resists an effective authoritarian. I mean, I don't know. I know no one has a crystal ball, thank God, at this point. But what do you see? What do you both see ahead of us? I mean, it seems that talking about fascism is not anachronistic any longer. So, are we in some sort of situation that we've seen before in the interwar period, or not?
And finally, we have one last question.
Hi, Brian, Patrícia. Thank you for sharing so much with us. It's devastating, but anyway. So I have a question about something that Brian said, but the question goes to both of you. You mentioned about the capacity of the U.S. government or like Trump's followers to follow through in what they promise. But the question is whether following through even matters in the current context. It seems to me that a lot of effects can be made. We can see them happening, even if there's no effective result per se. Like if there's no result, the idea of an effective authoritarian in this sense is it's quite complicated because you don't need to affect change in a more concrete way to have some sort of impact. What I'm thinking about is like, could the Trump government do something that would impact the Brazilian government in terms of discourse and, let's use the word narrative, politically speaking, electorally speaking, considering how the Lula administration has been framed as weak, for example? And could it be another thing on the pile of evidence that, well, this is a weak administration and they haven't even been able to, push back against Trump or like to do something against the US government? So the question is about whether following through in those international threats even matters if you're able to tarnish your opponents.
Okay, so I'm going to start with maybe. I think in the last 5 years since Bolsonaro's election, actually we've been seeing this trend of this privatization of the marketplace of ideas, right? The public square is no longer public; it's totally privatized, and the way that X was used here in the U.S. during the elections, which in Brazil, I mean, we have this electoral rules to have a level playing field in that you have equal access, or at least you try to communication outlets and to all that. And the way that you can, like, I own the public square and I do with it whatever I want. In that sense, I think all that just got, it's a stronger trend. I mean, it's deepening because now what we see here in the US is these guys are in a fusion with the government, right? Like you can really tell what's big tech, what's government. And in Brazil, one thing is, I mean, the Bolsonaro administration, they're no longer in power. So the whole state apparatus they had to mold the narrative and to, even though I think, it's a very small part of this that is centralized, right? There's like the organic part of it is very effective. And what makes a difference is how effectively you as a leader, as a populist leader, you can influence and galvanize your supporters to spread your message, right? In that sense, Bolsonaro is out of power, so he lost part of this in his power. But there's still, media is less and less influential and has less and less credibility, unfortunately. I was reading a column last year here while I was covering the election saying, if Trump won the election, that means he can't be reading or watching what we're writing, right? half the country is not. And the media ecosystem is more and more fragmented, right? And you're going to have this in the White House press conferences every day. You're going to have, podcasters. You're going to have hyperpartisan news sites and all that. So the power that we as mainstream media have to influence or to mold the narrative is smaller and smaller. At the same time, who's actually producing factual information and not opinion? I mean, who's going to be supplying, checked information and not just opinion? So I think this trend is it's stronger. You have this more control of the company, and we haven't had regulation. I think regulation could somehow start to try to balance things. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but the thing I know is that there's these two things. I mean, there's unregulated big tech controlling the public square, privatized square, and on the other hand, diminished power of media and diminished credibility. How to equate these two things?
So the question about like what is power, I kind of understand as let me try to answer this, and I don't know if this is the right way to answer this or not, but it made me think of how Lula conducted his campaign in 2022. And it was interesting. He explicitly did not talk about democracy much. If you go look in transcripts, you can find it. I mean, it was part of his message, but it was far from being the focus of his message. And I talked to some of his people about that. I talked to everybody, by the way. I mean, I have good contacts in the Bolsonaro space. I know you do as well. But what the Lula people, I raised this with them. I said, it seemed to me like he didn't really talk much about it. And they said, no. He talked about people's day-to-day concerns. He talked about inflation. He talked about the price of picanha. He did. That was one of the centerpieces of his campaign. And it seems to me like, especially during the end of the Kamala Harris campaign, that was a lesson that she did not take to heart, right? Because her campaign, which was very short, it started off with these sort of people's real life day-to-day concerns. And then I felt like as we got closer and closer to the election day, it became more about Trump. And it's interesting, the Lula manual for, kind of how he conducted his campaign and also conducted his presidency, he didn't talk about that much about democracy. He didn't even talk that much about Bolsonaro himself. I think that's interesting. And then the question about like, does follow through matter? I mean, look, I think, again, like I talked to the Trump people too, and he has concrete goals that are very clear. He wants less immigration, specifically irregular immigration, but maybe less immigration in general. He wants less inflation. He wants less drugs coming into the country. He wants less China in like the hemisphere and in the United States. And I think if he focuses on that agenda, then he will probably be seen as successful. You look at polling, and that's what most Americans want too. I worry less about an authoritarian Trump. That's not what has me watching things carefully. Because I think there are and will continue to be some checks and balances in our system. What I worry is that basically the liberal order gets destroyed. And, specifically that we destroy the trading relationships and values-based alliances. And I know people roll their eyes at that idea, and I understand why, but is that still not only an animating idea has that been a U.S. foreign policy value? Has it been pursued imperfectly and sometimes cynically? Of course, yes, but is there something to that still? Yeah, I think so. And these alliances and these norms and ideas that have led to the relative peace and prosperity of the last several decades. That's kind of what I worry is under threat. And we've certainly seen evidence in these 15 days that is explicitly what he's trying to dismantle. I guess for the purposes, though, of this discussion, when you look at those priorities, the immigration, inflation, drugs, China, Brazil is not front and center on those. And maybe that's a point in favor.
Which is sad, right?
Huh?
Which is so sad, right?
Well,
We're celebrating that we're not that important.
that's
Like
funny.
he's not going to notice us, so it's good.
That's a funny way of thinking about it, but I tell you, there are people in Panama and Colombia and elsewhere right now who are like, stay off his radar as long as you can. And maybe that's a point in favor of Brazil being able to live and coexist in relatively calm waters for at least a certain percentage of the next 4 years.
Thank you so much, Brian and Patrícia. Thank you so much for the audience for coming. Thank you, Deborah. And let's give our visitors the last round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.